In June 2009, the world stood still as it mourned the loss of an icon. But the truth is, Michael Jackson had begun to break many years before that final curtain call. From the sting of a leather belt in a cramped rehearsal room at the age of 5, to the literal fires that scarred his body, and finally to the relentless court of public opinion that proved more surgical than any blade. We must ask ourselves, was his fame a gift or a life sentence for a sensitive soul? Today we look past the charts and the shattered records to witness the brilliant yet tear-stained journey of a legend who spent his entire life trying to heal the world, only to die as its loneliest inhabitant. This is the tragic story of the King of Pop. To truly understand the tragedy of Michael Jackson, one must look past the glittering military jackets, the shattered records, and the heavy crown of the king. You have to travel back to Gary, Indiana, a gray industrial town where the smoke from the steel mills blotted out the sun. It was here that a boy named Michael was born, and it was here that his childhood was dismantled before it even began. At an age when most children are afraid of the dark, Michael was forced to be afraid of the light, the harsh, unforgiving spotlight of a world that demanded he be a professional before he was even a person. Michael's childhood was not lived, it was surgically managed. While other children in Gary were learning to ride bicycles, scraping their knees in the dirt, or playing tag as the sun went down, 5-year-old Michael was already clocked into a grueling full-time job. To the world, he was a miracle, a prodigy with a voice that held the soul of a grown man. But to his father, Joe Jackson, Michael was not a son to be held. He was a business asset to be polished. Joe, a man hardened by the steel mills and driven by a desperate, almost violent ambition to escape poverty, ruled the Jackson household like a drill sergeant. In the Jackson house, there were no playdates. There were no toys under the bed. There was only the relentless, suffocating pursuit of perfection. The rehearsals for the Jackson 5 were not music lessons. They were military drills conducted in an atmosphere of pure terror. Joe Jackson would sit in a wooden chair, his face a mask of cold discipline with a leather belt gripped firmly in his hand. If a dance step was missed, if a harmony was flat, the belt would strike. Michael later recalled that the fear was so visceral, so deep-seated, that the mere sound of his father's footsteps or the sight of him entering a room would cause Michael to physically retch and vomit from pure anxiety. The thunderous applause of millions that followed in the years to come could never quite drown out the haunting silence of a childhood lost within the soundproof walls of recording booths. Imagine a little boy standing on a stool to reach the microphone singing about love and heartbreak he was too young to understand, while through the studio window he watched other children playing in a park outside. He once confessed that he would stare at them and weep, feeling like a prisoner of his own talent. This environment of fear and forced labor created a permanent fracture in Michael's soul. It molded him into a perfectionist who would settle for nothing less than the impossible, but it also left him emotionally frozen in time. He became a man who could command a stadium of 100,000 people with a single snap of his fingers, yet felt like a lost, terrified child in a room full of adults. His later creation of Neverland Ranch was not the whim of an eccentric billionaire. It was a desperate, multi-million-dollar attempt to buy back the innocence that had been stolen in Gary. It was a sanctuary for the ghost of the boy who never got to play. Fame gave Michael Jackson the world, but it demanded an unthinkable trade. It took away his humanity, leaving a wound that all the gold records in history could never heal. But the wounds of a stolen childhood were only the beginning of a much larger metamorphosis. As Michael stepped out from the stifling shadow of his father and into the solo spotlight of the late 70s, he didn't just want to be a star. He wanted to be the brightest light in the human firmament. He sought to fill the hollow void left by his lost youth with the roar of millions embarking on a frantic quest for a level of perfection that the human soul was never meant to sustain. He was a man running away from a traumatic past, trying to build a future so brilliant that no one would ever see the scars underneath. By the early 1980s, Michael Jackson had achieved the impossible. With the release of Thriller, he became more than a musician. He became a global deity, a cultural force that transcended race, language, and borders. Yet this historic success came with a heavy, unseen psychological tax. Michael became obsessed with an unattainable standard driven by a haunting belief that good was the ultimate enemy of great. He pushed his body to the absolute brink of exhaustion, refining every moonwalk, every vocal hiccup, and every bass line until they were flawless. Behind the scenes, he was a man living under a microscope, a prisoner of a fame so vast that he could no longer walk down a street or sit in a park. The world's gaze became a suffocating weight, and the man behind the mask began to slowly disappear into the towering shadow of his own legend. Then, on January 27, 1984, the trajectory of his life was altered in a single terrifying instant. During the filming of a Pepsi commercial at the Shrine Auditorium, a pyrotechnic malfunction sent a shower of sparks directly into Michael's hair. For several haunting seconds, the King of Pop continued to dance and spin on stage, unaware that his scalp was engulfed in flames. It was a moment of cruel cinematic irony, the world's greatest entertainer burning under the very lights he had spent his entire life chasing. When he finally emerged from the smoke held up by his security team, his face was calm, but his life was shattered. The physical damage was catastrophic, leaving him with second- and third-degree burns that would never truly heal. But the hidden internal damage was far more devastating. This accident was the catalyst for Michael's introduction to the world of heavy medical-grade painkillers, a dark chemical dependency that would haunt his footsteps for the next 25 years. To cope with the excruciating chronic pain and the repeated agonizing scalp surgeries, he turned to the only thing that offered numbing relief. Furthermore, the trauma of the fire accelerated a physical transformation that horrified the public. The stress triggered his vitiligo, a condition that began to destroy his skin's pigment, turning his complexion into a patchwork of white and brown. The media, which once celebrated his genius, now turned into a pack of wolves. They mocked his changing skin, his surgical masks, and his increasingly fragile appearance, never realizing that the man in the mirror was simply trying to survive a body that was in constant, agonizing rebellion. He was no longer a person to them. He was a specimen to be dissected. The price of his perfection was no longer just his sweat and tears, it was his very identity. Michael Jackson was winning the world, but in the process he was losing the man he used to be. By the dawn of the 1990s, Michael Jackson was no longer just a man battling physical pain and a changing reflection. He was facing a much more predatory enemy. He had built a wall of fame so high that it had become a fortress, but that fortress was about to be breached. The world that had once worshipped his every move was growing bored with his genius and became hungry for a scandal. The man who had spent his millions trying to build a sanctuary in Neverland, a place where he could finally be the child he was never allowed to be, was about to find out that his paradise was actually a glass house and the world was picking up stones. In 1993, the first allegations of child abuse surfaced, and the impact was equivalent to a nuclear blast in the world of pop culture. For a man who had publicly yearned for the innocence of childhood, the accusations were a cruel, almost unthinkable irony. He was a man who felt more comfortable in the company of children because they were the only ones who didn't want anything from him, the only ones who didn't judge him. But the media saw something different. They didn't see a wounded man trying to heal his past. They saw a monster. Though the 1993 case was settled out of court and no charges were ever filed, the damage was permanent and irreversible. The seed of doubt had been planted in the collective mind of the public. The media, which had once hailed him as a hero, transformed overnight into a ferocious predator. They coined the nickname Wacko Jacko, a dehumanizing label that Michael hated with every fiber of his being. He was no longer a person. He was a caricature, a freak show for the evening news. A decade later, the nightmare returned with an even more terrifying intensity. In 2003, following a controversial documentary that twisted his words, Michael was hit with new, more severe criminal charges. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a public crucifixion played out in real time on every television screen on Earth. For months in 2005, Michael Jackson had to walk into a courtroom in Santa Maria, California to defend his very soul. Every detail of his eccentric life, his private habits, and his unique home was dissected, mocked, and sensationalized. He was forced to explain his heart to a world that had forgotten how to be kind. The pressure was almost inhumane. Here was a man who was already physically frail, struggling with a dependency on medication, now forced to face a potential life sentence behind bars. On June 13, 2005, the verdict came in not guilty on all counts. But as Michael walked down the courthouse steps, there was no celebration in his eyes. He had won the legal battle, but he had lost the war for his dignity. The court of public opinion had already handed down its sentence, and it was a life term of suspicion. The man who believed in magic and the inherent goodness of people had seen the darkest, most vengeful side of humanity. Neverland, the sanctuary he had built with such love, now felt violated, polluted by the footsteps of investigators and the prying eyes of cameras. He packed his bags and never truly lived there again. He became a nomad, a ghost wandering the globe in search of a peace that no longer existed. The accusations had created a fracture in his soul that no verdict could ever heal. The king was free, but he was a king without a country, and more importantly, a man without a home. The man who emerged from the shadows of the 2005 trial was no longer the electric performer who had once conquered the world with a single snap of his fingers. He was a ghost, a fragile, hollowed-out version of his former self. The legal battles had not only shattered his spirit and decimated his reputation, but they had also bled his massive financial empire to the point of collapse. The king of pop, a man who had once generated billions for the music industry, found himself drowning in a sea of debt, forced to shutter the gates of Neverland and live as a high-profile nomad. He moved from Bahrain to Ireland, from Las Vegas to rented mansions in Los Angeles, always searching for a sanctuary that the world was no longer willing to give him. Behind the closed doors of his rented rooms, a far more dangerous battle was being fought. Michael's body, after decades of punishing choreography and the trauma of the 1984 fire, was a landscape of chronic pain and exhaustion. The dependency on prescription medication, which had begun as a desperate way to manage physical agony, had now spiraled into a lethal necessity. He was plagued by a debilitating chronic insomnia, a mind that raced with the anxieties of his debts and his legacy, refusing to shut down even as his organs begged for rest. He lived in a state of twilight, surrounded by a rotating door of handlers, bodyguards, and doctors, many of whom were more interested in his remaining earning power than his survival. The line between medical care and chemical sedation became a blur, and Michael became a prisoner to the very substances that promised him a moment of peace. Then came the announcement of This Is It, a staggering 50-night residency at London's O2 Arena. It was marketed as the greatest comeback in history, but for Michael, it was a desperate gamble. He needed the money to save his family from financial ruin, and he needed the applause to prove that he was still the king. But at 50 years old, he was gay, frail, and physically depleted. Behind the curtain of the high-energy rehearsal footage the world would later see was a man who often had to be blanketed in heaters because his body could no longer regulate its own temperature. He was rehearsing for a spectacle that would have challenged an athlete in their prime, while he himself was existing on a cocktail of drugs just to stand up, and the powerful surgical anesthetic propofol just to close his eyes for a few hours of artificial sleep. On the morning of June 25, 2009, the music finally stopped. In a quiet bedroom in Holmby Hills, the heart that had beaten in rhythm for the entertainment of billions reached its limit. His death was not a sudden accident. It was the final, inevitable chapter of a slow and agonizing erosion of a human being. When the news broke, the internet buckled under the weight of the world's grief, but the tragedy was that Michael had been dying in plain sight for years. He had been squeezed dry by an industry that demanded his genius but ignored his pain. The world mourned the loss of a legend, but perhaps they should have mourned the boy who was never allowed to grow up, the man who was never allowed to be human, and the star who burned so brightly that he eventually consumed himself. In the end, Michael Jackson didn't just leave the stage. He was finally released from a life that had become a gilded cage of his own making. The moment the news of Michael Jackson's passing broke the world didn't just stop, it shattered. The digital infrastructure of the planet buckled under the weight of billions searching for the truth, hoping against hope that it was just another tabloid rumor. But as the gates of UCLA Medical Center remained closed and the helicopters circled overhead, a grim reality began to sink in. The king was gone, and in an instant the air changed. The mockery that had defined the last 2 decades of his life vanished, replaced by a deafening collective sob of a world that realized it had lost something truly irreplaceable. There is a profound and bitter irony in the aftermath of Michael Jackson's death. In his final years, he was a man hunted by debt, ridiculed by late-night comedians, and treated as a pariah by the very industry he had built. Yet within hours of his passing, he was a saint again. His album surged to the top of every chart in every country. The debt that had threatened to crush him was cleared within years as his catalog became more valuable than ever. The same media outlets that had spent years calling him Wacko Jacko and dissecting his surgeries suddenly began airing 24-hour tributes celebrating the genius they had helped to dismantle. It was a haunting reminder of our own human nature. We tend to destroy our legends while they are with us, only to worship the ghosts they leave behind. We realized, perhaps too late, that we had demanded a perfection from Michael that no human soul was ever meant to sustain. But beyond the courtroom battles, the financial collapses, and the tragic physical decline, there remains the music, the one part of Michael that could never be broken. To look at his legacy is to look at the blueprint of modern entertainment. Every pop star who stands on a stage today, every dancer who synchronizes a move to a bass line, and every artist who uses a music video to tell a cinematic story is a direct descendant of the path Michael Jackson blazed. From the infectious joy of "Don't Stop Till You Get Enough" to the global plea of Earth Song, his voice became a universal language. He was the man who broke the color barrier on MTV, the man who brought the world together to sing "We Are the World," and the man who taught us that music could be a force for healing even when the singer himself was bleeding. The tragic story of Michael Jackson is a mirror held up to society. It is a cautionary tale of what happens when we idolize the art, but forget to protect the artist. It is the story of a boy who was given the world but had his soul carved out by the very people who cheered for him. He was a king without a kingdom, a father who wanted his children to have the childhood he never knew, and a star that burned with such blinding intensity that he eventually consumed his own light. As the final curtain falls on this narrative, we are left with a simple, heartbreaking truth. Michael Jackson spent his entire life trying to make the world a better place. Yet he died wondering if the world would ever truly love the man behind the mirror. The stage is now dark, and the spotlight has finally faded. Rest in peace, Michael. The world is a little quieter without your song, and the path you walked was lonelier than we could ever imagine. But the moonwalk will last forever.